In the Kuban region of the USSR, on the shore of the Azov Sea, 40 kilometers from the city of Yeysk, there is a small fishing village located around a group of grain elevators. It is called Periprava. We moved there in the beginning of March 1927. Snowstorms were still raging over the ice-covered sea. The snowdrifts enveloped our cottage almost up to its eaves, and in the mornings we couldn't get out without a shovel. But the cottage was warm, heated by chips of horse dung that we bought from the local people. The chips were easy to ignite and held heat for a long time. And so the cold winter passed. The sun warmed the earth, and with the spring thaw, the steppes came alive. The steppe grass turned green and began to grow quickly. The ice began to move on the sea and was then swiftly carried out by the strong current. Finally, the swans flew in and settled themselves on the marshes of the bay. This was a sanctuary for migrating birds and a resting place for those that were flying further north. The tired and hungry flocks of geese and ducks would settle on the water, noisily flapping their wings and quacking so loudly that we would be awoken from our sleep. The city was beginning to experience unemployment. However, since my husband was unable to find work, we decided to move on to Mariupol. This came at the time when the new economic policy, NEP, was coming to an end. Although the state was struggling to organize collective farms, there were still many free merchants, частники, working at the Mariupol market. Because of the high unemployment, no one had money. We found ourselves spending the last of our rubles on looking toward an uncertain future. While searching long and hard for the work, my husband registered at the unemployment office as required. Almost immediately he was arrested. By that time my father had already passed away, and here I was with 2 little children, without resource or assistance, and with little hope of finding a job. I began looking in offices, factories, at construction sites. Everywhere I heard the same response: there is no work. With the advent of unemployment registration, the authorities introduced the so-called record of service. The huge employment hall could not accommodate all of the unemployed, and the lines moved very slowly. To get to the registrar's window, one had to spend almost the entire day waiting in line. "Do you have your record of service?" "No, I haven't worked before." "Where does your husband work?" "Oh, I see. Come back tomorrow." "But I have hungry children. I'll take the hardest job." I said, "Come back tomorrow. Next." The crowd had already pushed me away from the window. So it was. Once in a while I was able to work for a day, hauling bricks to a construction site or cleaning up stores. This was not sufficient work because even a full day's pay was barely enough to buy a little bread, and so we starved. "Mommy, did you bring us some bread?" "No, my children, I couldn't find work today." "Well, all right, then bring us some tomorrow." This was how my children often greeted me. My husband returned after serving his 6-year sentence. He returned to find himself again without work, under the surveillance of NKVD and without friends. All friends had also been arrested. while others were too afraid to continue a friendship. He did manage to find someone, but sometimes he would come home tipsy from drinking. And that is how it continued until the catastrophe, which destroyed our family completely. Mariupol was the main city of our region, and our office was considered the regional one. The city councils that belonged to our office were called the periphery. All the farmers living on the periphery, whether they owned livestock or not, were expected to contribute a precise amount of meat to the government agency. In addition, the state took their surpluses and levied fines down the last cow or goat. They were labeled as unwilling and evil tax evaders. For the first time in my life, I actually saw a cow cry. An elderly couple was ordered to give up their cow to the state. "We cried the whole way," the old man said. My wife was hugging and stroking her Mashka, and Mashka seemed to understand where she was being taken. "You see, she's still crying," and sure enough I could see tears coming from the eyes of the cow. After stroking this cow, the old people, deprived and crying, shuffled back the 10 kilometers to their village. The regime that supposedly represented the worker peasant had just robbed them. In 1932, our city was experiencing hunger and began to die. The villagers still had bread, but were unaware that they, too, would soon suffer the fate of the city dwellers. The policy of taking the grain and bread from farmers began in the 1920s, when the state later realized that it couldn't do without the farmers. It introduced the new economic policy, NEP. With the arrival of the Stalinist era, however, the state began a policy of extreme and repressive measures with the purpose of organizing the collective farms. Sweeping every last grain from the beans of the peasants, the authorities then sent them away to Siberia or the Solovki Islands, without consideration to the sick, the aged, or the children, and without even allowing time to say goodbye. The police would arrive and, at gunpoint, force these people into trucks, ignoring the wailing, the crying, and the moans. The state moved over 50 homeless teenagers into our building. My kitchen suddenly became communal property. At first, we didn't hit it off too well. "Find a book and read something to them," my husband suggested. To ensure grabbing their attention, I selected for them The 7 Who Were Hanged by Andreev. Walking to the kitchen, I said, "Well, kids, I would like to read to you a little." A few grumbled, "Go ahead, read," while the others were hostile and silent. Initially, they didn't appear interested. Patiently, I kept reading. I couldn't finish the book that evening, but when I turned to leave, some of them wanted to know when I would return so that they could find out what happened. The following evening, they came around again to sit and listen, even shushing those who were making noise. The storm, too, had passed. Life moved along swiftly. Before one had time to think of today, the concerns of the next day overtook us. The arrests continued. The Greeks and the Ukrainians were labeled as enemies of the people and taken away. Then the engineers were arrested, followed by bank directors and their assistants, office workers, school principals, and many others. I too had to bid farewell to my husband. We shall meet again at God's throne. Forgive me and farewell." One evening I took my place in a line for meat in order to be among the first when they opened at 7 in the morning. By 9 I had to be at work. I reserved my space, making sure that all those in front and behind me knew who I was, and went home to check up on my ill children. Many women at that time had sick children requiring attention. It was around 4 in the morning, and going home was chilly and frightening. I hurried along in the center of the street without looking back. Making a turn onto my street, I passed the NKVD headquarters and noticed several heavily loaded trucks headed for the train station. I moved to the sidewalk and walked alongside them, counting 8 trucks. By chance, I happened to look into the last truck and collapsed from shock. Underneath the stretched canvas, I saw a pair of human eyes looking at me. My knees began to shake. When I stopped, a thought hit me like a lightning ball. I could be arrested right here on the spot for witnessing this and never see my children again. Apparently, they were moving inmates from the NKVD basement to the trains. I lagged behind the caravans, and as soon as I turned the corner, ran down the street and directly home. The Germans tore Poland to pieces in a few days, descending on the country like an evil hurricane. The Poles ran toward the border for safety and were met there with bayonets. 12,000 of the Polish army's finest had to take refuge in Katyn forest. Nor was Russia spared the fate of Poland. The German vultures swept down on the Russian soil, crumbling and burying everything in their path and bringing death. With the war came the flood of refugees. As soon as the first bomb was dropped on Poland, bread and all other products disappeared from the market. To receive a quarter of a pound of margarine, I stood in a line with 7,000 people, and behind me there were at least as many. We stood day and night and got nothing. Work was stopped at the Azovstal plant after the initial attack. Machines were removed and specialists evacuated. After Azovstal, another, even larger plant, the Ilyich, stopped production. Smaller factories and shops also began closing. The result was that in virtually one day, 150,000 people lost their jobs. How were we now going to feed our children, the elderly and our invalids? Where were we to get money to buy bread? No one had savings. What was bought was eaten. It was then that people had begun to understand the severity of their situation. Panic insidiously crept into our souls. Our city was soon surrounded by the Germans. 20 or so soldiers ran down our street, and everything grew quiet. The troops finally passed by. The shooting ceased. People began walking up and down the street. My daughter ran up to me. "Mommy, the girls are going to look in on the stores. Maybe there is some bread left. Can I go?" "Go ahead, but come right back." The store was around the corner. Just as they turned the corner, I saw them running back. "Mommy, there is a German soldier on a bicycle." It was a motorcycle. This was a sign that the Germans took the city without a battle. Everyone breathed a sigh of relief. There were some men who had been critically injured and were unable to move. My children and the other women organized a group for the assistance of the injured and went around openly asking people to give what they could. As it turned out, there were thousands of these POWs. When the military front moved deeper into our country, some of them were released and made their way home. Those that lived further away joined local collective or private farms, which continued to exist under the Germans. Suddenly, the authorities announced that these former prisoners should report for registration. Those that came were placed behind bars, and Mariupol had its first concentration camp. Up to now, the Jews had been left alone and walked about freely, although the authorities were keeping track of them. On a certain day, old man Gorlin, who had been a neighbor, came knocking on my door and informed us that the Germans had ordered the Jews to pack up their belongings and prepare to leave. By evening of the same day, we watched as they were led down the street toward the military barracks outside of the city. By the time we ran outside, the first column had already passed the house. In front were the rabbis, the doctors and their families, and the Jewish intelligentsia. Next were the elderly supported under the arms, the sick on stretchers, and the children walked along, carrying knapsacks and small bundles. The procession moved very slowly. After the last column passed and the convoy had all but disappeared from view, we saw a young woman running with two children, desperately trying to catch up. She held an infant under one arm. Clutching her other hand was a 3-year-old girl, dragging a large doll. The guards had apparently forgotten about them. That doll was slowing them down, so the mother grabbed the girl with the doll and placed her on top of a bundle that was tied to her arm. Then she continued running, trying to catch up with her people. It was difficult to believe that they would shoot down 7,500 people for no reason. But several days later, they were executed and buried in those same trenches that we had dug around the city before the Germans arrived. A vile, inhuman, and criminal act had taken place in history. Several people died in our building. The Jews had been killed, and the yard became empty. My children and I were sent to Germany. At the Mariupol station, we said goodbye to everything that had been dear to us, and we said goodbye forever. The railway car was filled to the limit, and the doors were bolted shut with a padlock. One of the men in the prison was a German soldier, a deserter. He had been arrested because he went home to visit his sick wife and children without permission. He told us about the battle at Stalingrad and the German defeat on all of the fronts, the armies destroyed and retreating. He said that half of Germany was already in American hands. We listened in amazement, not believing our ears, but saying nothing. We didn't want to miss a single word of his account. Throughout our entire 4-year imprisonment, we had not known what was happening on the military front. We stood for hours in the hallway with the other prisoners, talking without being told to return to our cells.